practicum work. So I direct the practicum work in terms of working for community organizations. Ways in which to help the community, which we could think of as being pathological at times, could we not? I mean, think of the neighborhood as being pathological, a community as being pathological, a community that is not welcoming, that is not affirming, that does not, to use Report's term, attest to people's sufferings in the way that it can. So I was trying to search for a way in which to have that utopian potentiality. And by the way, I'm using that term, right, instead of saying utopia, that's ludicrous from my perspective. I'm not looking for a utopia, I'm looking for a place to stand, a trembling place to stand, maybe a place to stand. So I'm going to take my glasses off and not be able to see any of you, which is good because I'll just sort of pretend I'm alone in my room in front of my mirror. The title of my work is Hermeneutics of Love for Community Research, Suffering and Acting on Trembling Ground. And I'm going to do something that Brent was doing, which is read a few quotations first, because I don't know, Brent's got me into quoting. Like, if you're on Facebook with Robbins, he's quoting. I don't really have to write a paper, I just take his quotes and put them together and go, thanks. But these might be a few that he didn't put on Facebook. These might be a few that he doesn't even know about. No, probably not. So the first one's by Audre Lorde, and let me read that for you. It was a while before we came to realize that our place was the very house of difference, rather than the security of any one particular difference. This one's from Roberto Esposito. Nothing seems more appropriate than thinking community. Nothing more necessary, demanded, and heralded by a situation that joins in a unique epochal knot, the failure of all communisms with the misery of all new individualisms. And finally, I'll just read a quick one here by Robert Gibbs. We are responsible for each other in a mutual way when justice requires us to become present, one to another. But even in the present, where equality and fairness have their place, the instability of ethical responsibility arises. The instability of ethical responsibility arises. I teach a social psychology course. The last month of the social psychology course, we do nothing but sit around in a circle listening to Pink Floyd, The Wall. We listen to the album, everybody gets a copy of the lyric. I am a little bit afraid of copyright people bursting in the room every once in a while. And we study it intensely. Partly why I'm going to begin in paper with that is because of my familiarity with doing that type of stuff. So let me just begin with a little Pink Floyd, The Wall. In the Pink Floyd album, The Wall, the song Hey You is an attempt at a socio-cultural therapeutic in that it is an attempt at generating and welcoming empathy. But the nauseating meta-discourse in this song and throughout the album tells us it's not easy to bang your heart against some mad bugger's wall. We are told that Pink's hopeful attempt was just a fantasy or a utopian potentiality. In essence, Pink's response to this profound loss of hope is to become comfortably numb, right? To be comfortably numb. And yet even within this song, which marks the turning point in the album toward utter despair, there is, I love this line, a fleeting glimpse, a moment of uncovering, or Augenblick, to use Heidegger's term. This fleeting glimpse, I interpret as a promising moment that is, as pathetic as it is, a trembling ground of humility and love that may be appropriate for community action researchers. The community suffers. By suffering, I signify pathos, right? We know that term, as the experience of lived suffering. And in contrast, apathos, right? Apathy, which is a deadened response to suffering. And as such, the antithesis to empathy, inward self-suffering as others suffer. Today, in part, I want to explore the degree to which empathy remains wedded to idem, making the other the same. I would like to show the dangers in remaining a in self of totality, that is, when empathizing remains a self-made ego, and as such, attempts at empathy become pathos like pathos, or I will suffer for you only if you are the same as me, or that empathy makes you the same as me. If this be the case, to some extent, empathy fails when the wholly unreconciled and singular other comes along. I'm using a little Derrida there with those terms. Just a little Derrida. That's all I ever can use. I get like a paragraph, and I run with it. Beyond empathy, then, is to suffer for the wholly other, to suffer for that which, for each of us, is inexpressible and irreplaceable, explicitly the otherness of others. Such suffering I call allopathic, the word allo meaning other, and pathic, pathos. Because such suffering, which I call allopathic, decenters us and disrupts us. It provides a radical, empathic, phenomenological stance as a community researcher, I believe, albeit on a trembling ground and impossible foundation. Allopathy maybe become a methodology of the oppressed, to use Sandoval's term, a Derridian supplement, namely something originary but marginalized, and that needs to be added, which is the other's interpretation of us. Hermeneutics, right, as the other's interpretation of us. Allopathy, as a radicalized empathy for the community, signifies a cure that is opposite of one is afflicted. We see that if the community is apathetic, the cure, so to speak, is not happiness, or worse yet, a pursuit of happiness, but the opposite, to suffer. Empathy, which stays within the natural attitude, would assume a taken-for-granted, same-to-same model of pathos, and therefore remain, as Levinas would say, hypostatic. Levinas indicates that hypostasis is that way in which we cope with our ontological insecurity of being born into a world of there is, or thrown, as Heidegger would say, into being itself. According to Levinas, the ego self-creates and self-instantiates itself into a solid, really real, bounded and encapsulated as a thing, thus totalized in relation to and in similarity with things. The ego establishes itself by recurrently identifying itself with itself, and thereby it makes itself the origin, the be-all and end-all, and self-evident. And it does not allow itself to be permeated by others. Other suffering, or allopathy, comes from the limital communitas. This comes from Victor Turner and Roberto Esposito. The threshold, which is the betwixt and between self and alterity, self and finitude. What the other, alterity, and death, finitude, share is no thing. They share the transcendent border. And communitas is that fleeting glimpse, I'm suggesting, of the infinite from the place of being finite. It is the glimpse of the other's infinite value. The healthy transformation of allopathy offers pathos for the apathetic. The community researcher works and loves. She or he suffers in the presence of others and for others. The hermeneutic of love that Dr. Robbins was speaking about lets us know that we can know others, just not completely. That we can be with others, allow others to commune with us, but not in an ideal community, as Iris Marion Young says, necessarily, or in a utopia, as I mentioned before. We can live together, Derrida tells us, with irreconcilable differences. I love that. We can live together with irreconcilable differences. I agree. And we can attest to those differences, not simply intolerate those differences. I put the F word in there. Did you hear it? Sorry. I'm from Jersey. That's all I do is curse. F word, F word. The fleeting glimpse of possibility can be a resolution, a praxis. Pink's Hey You was a call for vulnerability, responsibility, and hospitality. It was a gift to others in the Levinasian sense, and following Paul Ricoeur, it was an attestation. And following Derrida, it was a moment of deconstruction. So let's start with deconstruction first, humanistic people, if you don't mind. Don't throw anything. Deconstruction is a recurrent critique of all systems. Deconstruction keeps the ground trembling, and I, for one, like that. It keeps me on my toes, and it reminds me that although I stand on a trembling ground, I may nevertheless say yes, which is what Brent and I were talking about. I can attest, I can intervene, I can approach, I can confirm, I can affirm. Derrida defines deconstruction as, quote, a positive response to an alterity which necessarily calls, summons, or motivates it. Deconstruction is therefore a vocation. You see the practice in that. A response to a call. Such a vocation I call munificence. I'm stealing from Esposito again. Munis, you know, like a municipality, right? Munis meaning servitude. One is in service to the community that suffers. While deconstruction does search for a new investigation of responsibility, it can't found in ethics. It couldn't do that. By ethics here, I mean why and how we are with others in a community that leads to some good. We can say that I think it is that our community researchers, what we can say, I think, is that our community researchers may find that their interventions and interpretations emerge from the sheer otherness of others, which strikes at the very core of the knower and known. To call upon difference, Sheila Sandoval says, she explains that one must engage with the unsettling pleasures of faith, of hope, of a utopian potentiality. In fact, the suffering of the wholly other is by virtue of what Derrida calls différance, right? By the suffering other who brings play and hope of a utopian potentiality. To suffer for only those like us leads one to a narrowing view of the world. Its horizon of possibilities only includes the totalizing of others. I suspect this world would lack fecundity. That is to say, that one's world is impoverished because the breach break where the same and other may commune is deadened. Fecundity is, I think, that which is born of the liminal threshold, where there is an impossible possibility of hope for others, a hope that is born of other suffering. If we empathize with only those like us, we then restrict knowledge to preconceptualizations and totalizations. The aforesaid would amount to simply shielding oneself from the breach or lack that always and beautifully undermines our attempts at reducing the other to the same. Let's face it, the community gets read, it gets interpreted. The community researcher ought not to be the author authority, nor should the community researcher take part in some simplistic, postmodern, like, let everything go. That, in essence, would be nihilism. Ethnographers write. They write the community, and it is the ethics of writing that I am in part concerned with here. Quote, writing is ethical because it is a site of intertextual alliance between author and reader, because it grounds the disclosure of alterity. That's Richard Kearney. So herein lies the rub, that we are on a trembling ground, whereupon we must attest to the suffering of others. I'm primarily now using the work of Paul Ricoeur here, specifically the idea of attestation as a permissible foundation for ethical action on the part of the community action researcher.
Involved in this project with, or in this panel with Brent and Bob by way of a different but complementary project, which has really gotten carried forward, and I think I'm going to do something bigger with it after this. Although I'm not sure how. I think that's still going. So, what I promised to do today is to take up the question of value, specifically the valuing of masculine movement over feminine movement in modern Western culture. But rather than pursuing it along the traditional adversarial lines of thought which pervade feminist discourse most of the time, I'm going to draw on the ideas of Iris Young and Simone de Beauvoir and propose a dialogal phenomenological alternative. What I'm really proposing is that an attitude of benevolent, even radical curiosity accompanied by open dialogue has the potential to make the mysterious bonds of gender oppression and sexism fall away, leaving us transformed. Let's see. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Iris Young or Simone de Beauvoir, so I'm just going to sort of go forward with the assumption that you're familiar enough, but maybe not totally familiar. So I first read Iris Young's Throwing Like a Girl about 2 years ago, and I was surprised by the strength of my mostly negative reaction. It took several days of conversation with peers before I realized that most of what I was objecting to was the privileging of one way of moving over another. Young's essay, which was originally published in 1980, was a feminist response to Erwin Strauss's Upright Posture, which maybe more people have read. Young describes her essay as an attempt to theorize the effects of feminine socialization and sexual objectification on a woman's world-making movements, describing us as unable to be free in movement. I definitely agree that a feminist response to Strauss is important because it is a very phallic piece, and it needed to be critiqued. But I read in Young's response an underlying implication that moving in a decisive, goal-oriented way is the right way to move. It is a more valuable way to move. And that it is then, she juxtaposes it against this more contained, hesitant way of moving as the wrong way to move. I don't think she does it on purpose. I don't think she knew she was doing it. But it definitely was problematic for me. I think it's important to remember that there are many ways to move. It's not that simple. One example is just one, or two, actually. There's the elegant lady on the beach. She sits there soaking up the sun before she wades into the water and takes her time getting adjusted to the temperature before finally taking the plunge. And here actually I have an image of my mother and other people, you can sort of see them. And then, again, in stark contrast, there's a herd of children who go hurtling in as fast as they can get their shirts and shoes off. There are as many ways to move as there are people in the world, I think. What I find central to Young's argument, though it's not emphasized, is that it is not an issue of how you move as a man or woman. It is a question of how you feel in your movement. It seems to me that there are an infinite variety of ways to move authentically. And though it might be possible to arrange these styles on a spectrum from characteristically masculine to characteristically feminine, by narrating Throwing Like a Girl as a story of feminine oppression, Iris Young portrays inhibition and restriction of movement as a male-female problem when in fact it is a human problem, like so many other narrations that are told in binary terms. This isn't to say that there aren't points of resonance for me in Young's essay and in other traditional feminist literature. And it's important to acknowledge that she did come back to this 20 years later, which a lot of people don't know if you're interested in her work. She wrote Throwing Like a Girl 20 years later. Her commentary is insightful, it's evocative. It doesn't address all my concerns with her original piece, although it does address some. She points out that the social environment for women has changed since her adolescence. And she does this interesting move. Rather than defending the relevance of her paper, she provides a really compelling critique of the philosophical premise for Throwing Like a Girl, which relies on what she calls the contradictory Beauvoirian framework, which, if you're familiar with Simone de Beauvoir, relies on the immanence transcendence dichotomy, which, even if you love it, is problematic. So for Beauvoir, human life is seen as an interplay between immanence and transcendence.